Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. I had finally some time to look into the HDR implementation in Ghost of Yotei, and what can I tell you? It is on the same level as in Ghost of Tsushima, but that also means we have some issues as in Ghost of Tsushima with the shadow details and the average picture brightness. But as always, first things first. Ghost of Yotei supports the PlayStation 5 HDR system level calibration. That means you must set up this menu in the correct way. If you like to use HGIG, then enable HGIG before you set up this menu. If you like to use dynamic tone mapping on, then enable dynamic tone mapping on before you actually set up this menu. If you have any further questions, I made already a couple of videos about this HDR system level calibration tool on the PlayStation 5. Feel free to watch it. So, what was my first impression when I started Ghost of Yotei for the very first time with the standard HDR settings in the game? Because the only two settings what we actually have to change the appearance of the picture is the brightness setting and the contrast setting. So we're talking about both settings a little bit later, because I like to focus on the standard factory setting, which is contrast default and brightness set to 50. And the HDR implementation in Ghost of Yotei is very similar or probably identical to Ghost of Tsushima. That means we're getting all the nice specular highlights, really beautiful specular highlights depending on the scenery, time of day and stuff like that. But unfortunately, we're also getting all of the disadvantages. And the two issues, what I found in Ghost of Tsushima back then, and unfortunately we have the exact same issues in Ghost of Yotei, was shadow details and average picture brightness. So let's talk about shadow details. Let's talk about the HDR black level floor in this game first, and the latter is actually quite good. So we can have in certain situations a perfect HDR black level floor. That means the contrast is really good, but as you can see here also we can have a very bad HDR black level floor, which is done by creators intent, and there is not much we can do about it. And I have seen already comments that this game looks washed out, the HDR implementation is bad, and I mean, I can't agree on that, but I know or can understand why people are saying that, because the game can indeed look very washed out, but the problem is always it's not HDR in general, it's the creator's intent, because I have the feeling the only way to simulate fog or a washed out picture is really by raising the HDR black level floor, which is in my opinion a very bad idea, but that's the fact. So this game can deliver a perfect HDR black level floor, but sometimes the creator's intent is not to do so. So let's talk about shadows, let's talk about shadow details, and I'm pretty sure at some point you will ask yourself why I can't see all the details here in the corner, and that's exactly the same issue what we had with Ghost of Tsushima back then, especially indoors, but also sometimes outdoors when it was a darker environment. There was some sort of shadow crush. That means not all details in shadows were visible. But don't get me wrong, this is not a deal breaker, and this should be not the reason why you turn off or that you turn off HDR in this great fantastic game, because you would be a fool that if you have a proper HDR capable screen that you turn off HDR just in order to play in SDR. So I would not recommend that. And if we're now looking at those settings what we have in the game, we can make the HDR shadow details slightly better. But the question is, should we really do that? And now let's talk about the settings what we have in the game, and let's see if we can make it actually a little bit better if we change those settings. So the first scenario, the first testing what I'm showing you is contrast set to default. That means we're talking about contrast dramatic in a second, but we're just comparing brightness set to 50, which is the standard factory setting, and 60 and 70. Please keep in mind that I would not recommend at all to decrease the brightness setting down from 50, let's say, to 40 or even 30, because you will just end up with a very dark picture and you will have even more issues with the shadow details. And after testing the brightness setting in different scenarios, my recommendation is very simple. First of all, if you don't have any problems, then just don't touch it. Leave it at 50 because then you have the standard factory setting. If you, on the other hand, think there are some details sometimes missing, just increase it by one step from 50 to 60. At this very moment, I would not recommend to go any higher because if you now use 70 or above, you will start compromising the dynamic range in HDR. And as soon you increase the brightness even further, let's say from 60 to 70 or even higher, you will start lose maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And on the other end from the HDR spectrum, you will start increasing the HDR black level floor even further. That means at the end, you end up with less contrast. Yes, the picture is brighter, but it will also look more washed out. And that's why my recommendation in regards to the brightness setting and contrast set to default is very, very simple. If you don't have any issues, leave it at the standard factory setting 50. If you like to have a slightly better or brighter picture in general and more shadow details, slightly more shadow details, then increase it to maximum 60. 60 is the absolute maximum what I can recommend. And now let's talk about the contrast setting. Let's compare contrast default with contrast dramatic. And what is contrast dramatic actually doing? It is dramatically changing the contrast. That's exactly what this setting is doing by crushing even more shadow details and lifting or increasing the maximum peak brightness and specular highlights slightly. So you end up actually with a little bit more clipping in specular highlights. So at the end, your eye or your brain thinks, yes, there is more contrast, but in general, it's actually a very bad setting because you lose a lot of details, and yes, in certain situations the dramatic contrast setting will look slightly better compared to the default setting because there is already some sort of increased HDR black level floor, and the dramatic contrast will decrease or make it actually look better. But in general, I can't recommend to use contrast set to dramatic. But if you like to set the contrast to dramatic, go for it because it's absolutely up to you what you prefer. In regards to the brightness setting, the same counts as with contrast set to default. As soon you go above 60, you will compromise the dynamic range in HDR. You will get, of course, more details and shadows now if you set this to 70 and 80 in combination with contrast set to dramatic. But what's the point actually if you're now, let's say, crushing details by setting it to dramatic, and then on the other hand you increasing the brightness to get more details? So it's absolute, it doesn't make any sense. So again, my opinion is leave contrast set to default and increase, if you have to, the brightness to 60. And now of course the question is always HGHG versus dynamic tone mapping on, and this time I did not record anything on my TV because what I found is on YouTube it just doesn't look the same as what I've seen with my own eyes. So my own recommendation here is I found HGHG in combination with this game a little bit too dark because the average picture brightness in this game is not very bright, unfortunately, and there's no way to change this. Yes, you can increase the brightness setting, but this comes with disadvantages like increasing the HDR black level floor. So I found myself actually testing dynamic tone mapping on the LG G4 many times, and I found it sometimes the better option. The problem is now when you have when you play in the night, so in the game of course, night mission or something like that, then dynamic tone mapping on as always is very overbright in the picture. So it's very hard to recommend actually anything because at the end you must like the picture. So feel free to test HGHG or dynamic tone mapping on. The only thing what you should remember is that if you switch between those settings, HGHG and dynamic tone mapping on, you should also recalibrate the PlayStation 5 HDR system level menu because that's very important, as I have proven in one of my videos. So again, if you like to use HGHG, enable HGHG before you actually set up the PlayStation 5 HDR menu. If you like to use dynamic tone mapping on, enable dynamic tone mapping on before you set up the HDR system level calibration. That's for HDRI and dynamic tone mapping on. Okay, my friends, so that's it for this video. In my opinion, a really great HDR implementation, unfortunately with these same issues as we had with Ghost of Tsushima. That means average picture brightness and shadow details are not the best. So shadow details is actually not, I wouldn't say that very important, but it's not a deal breaker, okay, if you lose very minor details in shadows, okay, or you have the feeling you have shadow black level crush or something like that. The average picture brightness, on the other hand, is a different story because it should be a little bit higher, especially with HDRI enabled. So I would like to have actually some sort of a paper white setting in this game where we can increase the average picture brightness, but maybe, or we need to wait for the PC version, because then with some mods we can actually adjust this pretty well. So in this case, that's how it is. I still recommend to use HDR over SDR any day in this game because it just looks absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for watching me. I see you guys next time. Bye.